Welcome, my friend, to the warmth of Baker Street Ember. Settle in by the fire.
As we prepare for tonight's tale, I must ask, from which shadowy corner of the world are you listening? If you find comfort here, please subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Now,
the fog pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street like a thief trying to peer inside. Holmes sat motionless in his chair, the fire reduced to glowing embers, his mind famished for a worthy puzzle. Then came the knock, sharp, urgent. A telegram arrived moments later. Miss Lavinia Gray, darling of the Lyceum stage, had been blackmailed with letters threatening to expose a scandalous past. Scotland Yard saw simple extortion, but Holmes caught the first ember. The faint, unmistakable scent of heliotrope on the paper, a perfume sold only in one discreet shop in Mayfair. A spark in the darkness. From Baker Street, the fire would spread. Chapter 1. The first spark. I find myself once again setting pen to paper to record one of those singular cases which so often fell to the lot of my friend Sherlock Holmes. The events I am about to relate occurred in the bitter November of 1889, when the fog lay upon London like a dirty shroud, and the gas lamps along Baker Street burned dull orange through the murk. The coal seeped through every crack. One could taste coal smoke and the sour damp of the Thames on every breath. Hansom cabs rattled past below, their wheels hissing on wet cobblestones, while the 17 steps up to our sitting room creaked under the tread of visitors who came seeking light in the darkness. Mrs. Hudson's knock came at 7:30. She entered bearing a tray of hot tea that steamed in the chill air, and behind her followed a lady heavily veiled. When the veil was lifted, I recognized at once the celebrated face of Miss Lavinia Gray, raven hair swept back from a high forehead, eyes the color of storm clouds over the channel, skin pale as porcelain under the gaslight. Yet tonight that famous beauty was marred by fear. Her gloved hands trembled as she placed 5 folded letters upon our table. "I am being blackmailed, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low and controlled, though the strain showed in the quick rise and fall of her bosom. The writer threatens to reveal that I was once Nellie Brown, a barmaid in a Whitechapel public house, and that 15 years ago I bore a child out of wedlock who was placed in an orphanage in Stepney. If I do not deliver £1,000 tomorrow night at the abandoned warehouse in Limehouse Causeway, the entire story will be sent to every newspaper from Fleet Street to the provinces. Holmes had risen the instant she began to speak. He stood now by the fire, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes gleaming with that peculiar hungry light I knew so well. He took the first letter, held it to the hissing gas jet, then brought it close to his face and inhaled deeply. "Heliotrope," he murmured, "a sweet, powdery scent, not common, sold only at Parfumerie Lacroix in Mayfair, and in very small quantities. A small ember, Watson, but it glows with meaning." I confess I saw nothing remarkable at first. To my eye the letters appeared ordinary, cheap cream-laid paper, an educated hand, postmarks from various East End offices. Miss Gray explained she had already paid 2 smaller sums, always in cash left at prearranged dead drops. This final, larger demand had arrived with a chilling addition. Come alone, or the secret would burn her career and her forthcoming marriage to Sir Charles Wentworth to ashes. Holmes paced before the grate, the coal settling with soft, sharp pops. The smell of his strong shag tobacco began to mingle with the faint heliotrope still clinging to the letters and the damp wool of Miss Gray's cloak. "You went to Limehouse last night?" he asked. She nodded. "I left the envelope behind a loose brick as instructed, but when I returned an hour later to confirm it had been collected, I found a body, a man, stabbed through the heart, the envelope gone from the hiding place. I fled. This morning the newspapers say the dead man was Edward Slade, a known blackmailer of the East End. I fear the police will connect me to the crime." Holmes stopped pacing. He reached for the Persian slipper on the mantel, extracted a pinch of tobacco, and filled his briar. The match flared. Smoke curled upward in lazy spirals. "Describe Slade," he said. Tall, thin, pockmarked face, missing the two smallest fingers on the left hand. He wore a threadbare tweed suit, reeked of cheap cigarettes and gin. Holmes drew deeply, eyes half closed in thought. "The game is afoot," he said quietly. Then, turning to our visitor, "You will remain here tonight under Mrs. Hudson's care. Watson, be so good as to send a telegram to Lestrade requesting permission to view the body at the Limehouse mortuary tomorrow morning." Miss Gray protested weakly, but Holmes's tone admitted no discussion. As Mrs. Hudson led her away, he turned back to me. "Observe, Watson, the paper is French laid, yet the watermark has been carefully clipped away. Someone feared the mill might be traced. The ink is iron gall, but the flow indicates a new nib." The writer paused frequently to steady their hand, and note the loops on the G and Y, identical in every letter, yet the pressure varies as though emotion warred with control. A woman's hand, perhaps, or someone taking pains to imitate one. I stared at the letters spread on the table. A woman or a very clever man? The careful listener will have noticed the inconsistency. He smiled thinly. "A small ember. Did you catch its glow?" We sat in silence for some minutes, the fire crackling, the fog drumming softly against the window panes. Holmes took up his Stradivarius, plucked a few mournful notes, then set the instrument aside. "Slade was merely the messenger," he said. "Someone else composed these letters. Someone who knows Miss Gray's past with intimate precision, and who has ready access to heliotrope perfume." I could make nothing of it, but Holmes' face wore the peculiar look of satisfaction I had come to recognize. The first stirrings of the chase. The sitting room felt warmer now, though the fire had not changed. The first embers glowed in the darkness. The fire of truth had begun. Chapter 2. Gathering kindling. The following morning the fog had thinned enough to allow pale winter sunlight to struggle through, though the cold remained bitter and the air tasted of coal smoke and horse manure from the busy thoroughfares below. I rose early, the 17 steps creaking under my boots as I descended to send the telegram Holmes had requested. By 9 o'clock we were rattling eastward in a hansom cab, the wheels hissing on damp cobblestones, the horse's breath steaming white in the chill. Holmes sat silent beside me, his sharp profile turned to the window, eyes scanning the passing streets with restless intensity. The smell of his shag tobacco still clung faintly to his coat from the night before. At the Limehouse mortuary the air was dank and heavy with carbolic soap and the unmistakable metallic tang of death. Inspector Lestrade awaited us, his bowler hat in hand, expression caught between irritation and reluctant curiosity. Slade was a thorough-paced scoundrel, Lestrade said without preamble. Blackmailed half the East End at one time or another. Likely met his end when some victim decided to pay in steel instead of sovereigns. We've a witness, a night watchman, who saw a woman in a dark fur coat near the warehouse about 10 o'clock. She hurried away after a brief argument. Holmes said nothing at first. He bent over the slab where Edward Slade lay, pale and rigid, the ugly wound in his chest now cleaned, but still gaping. The dead man's threadbare tweed suit was sodden with blood and mud. Holmes scraped a small quantity of the reddish clay from the heel of the right boot with his penknife, deposited it carefully into an envelope, and sniffed the residue. "This mud is not native to Limehouse," he observed quietly. "It is a peculiar reddish clay mixed with coal dust and minute traces of copper filings. Such a combination occurs in only one place in London, the narrow alleys behind the Royal Mint Street Foundry, where naval brass is cast daily. Slade had no legitimate business there." Lestrade blinked. "How the devil?" "Data, data, data," Holmes replied with a thin smile. "I cannot make bricks without clay." We began gathering kindling in earnest that day. Our first call was to Parfumerie Lacroix in Mayfair, a discreet establishment whose windows displayed only the faintest gleam of crystal bottles. The proprietor, a small Frenchman with waxed mustaches, remembered the heliotrope well. 3 customers in the past month, gentlemen, he said, consulting his ledger. Mademoiselle Gray herself, she purchases it regularly for her dressing room. Mademoiselle Beatrice Lang, her understudy at the Lyceum, bought a small flacon last week. And 1 gentleman who paid in cash and gave no name, tall, well-dressed, spoke with an educated accent. Holmes purchased a tiny sample bottle, uncorked it, inhaled, and nodded once. The same scent exactly. An ember smoulders here, Watson. From Mayfair we proceeded to the Lyceum Theatre. The stage door smelled of grease paint, sawdust, and the faint sweetness of dying flowers left in the green room. Miss Gray's dressing room was small but elegant, polished mahogany table, velvet stool, a clutter of telegrams and face powder. Holmes examined the waste paper basket and lifted out a torn envelope. The postmark matched one of the Blackmail letters, posted from within the theatre itself, he said. The writer is close, very close indeed. We found Beatrice Lang rehearsing on the empty stage. She was younger than Miss Gray, perhaps 25, with ambitious eyes and a quick, nervous grace. She denied any acquaintance with Slade, but when Holmes asked her to remove her gloves, we saw that the left one lacked its bottom button. The thread holes were fresh and slightly frayed. A small detail, Holmes murmured to me as we left the wings, but it smoulders. It will ignite something larger. Our next visit was to the theatre manager, Mr. Harold Finch, a stout, perspiring man who tugged constantly at his starched collar. He protested perfect accounts, but Holmes's eye fell upon the cash box in the office. A quick glance at the ledger revealed small, regular discrepancies, sums missing over many months. Embezzlement on a petty scale, Holmes remarked when we were alone again. Not enough to ruin the house, but enough to provide motive for panic if discovered. The day closed at Scotland Yard, where Gregson allowed us to examine Slade's lodgings in Flower and Dean Street, Whitechapel. The single room reeked of opium smoke and stale cigarette tobacco. Among the litter of papers on the deal table lay a half-burned note in the same distinctive hand as the Blackmail letters. Holmes folded it into his pocket without comment. Back at Baker Street, the coal fire roared cheerfully against the gathering dusk. Kindling gathered, Watson, he said, drawing upon his pipe until the smoke curled thickly upward. The mud places Slade near the foundry, far from his usual haunts. The perfume leads back to the Lyceum. The internal postmark, the petty thefts, the missing button, they all smolder in the same direction. I invite you to pause here, dear reader. What would you deduce from the mud on the boots, the scent of heliotrope, and the single missing button? Holmes leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming. The flames approach. Kindling gathered. Smoke rising. The flames approached. Chapter 3. The smolder. By the 3rd day, the embers had begun to connect in ways that set my pulse quickening. The fog had lifted somewhat, yet a chill wind still carried the scent of coal smoke and distant river mud through the open window of our sitting room. Holmes spent the morning in his chemical corner, sleeves rolled back, the room thick with the sharp odor of nitric acid and heated copper. Test tubes bubbled softly. A small Bunsen flame hissed blue beneath a dish of the reddish clay we had taken from Slade's boots. At length he straightened, wiping his hands on a stained towel. The copper filings are not generic, he announced. They derive from a specific furnace at the Royal Mint Street foundry, one used exclusively for casting naval brass under Admiralty contract. The alloy contains a trace of tin not found in commercial work. Slade was never a metal worker, therefore he was taken, or his body was conveyed, to that place after death. I stood by the fire, warming my hands against the cold that seemed to have settled into my very bones. To mislead us then? Precisely. Someone wished the trail to point eastward, away from the true scene. We returned to the Lyceum that afternoon. The theater smelled of fresh paint and old velvet, the stage lights casting long shadows across the boards. Miss Gray met us in her dressing room, still pale but composed. Holmes asked to see her fur coat once more. She produced it from the wardrobe. The hem was clean, no trace of reddish clay. "You did not wear this to Limehouse," Holmes said. "You borrowed a plain cloak from the property department, did you not?" She admitted it with a small nod. I feared recognition. Holmes turned next to Beatrice Lang. She was in the wings, script in hand, rehearsed lines with forced brightness. When Holmes requested she remove her gloves again, she hesitated only a moment. The left glove still lacked its button. The thread ends were slightly frayed, as though recently torn. The careful listener will have noticed the inconsistency, Holmes murmured to me as we stepped aside. The button found near Slade's body matches this glove in size, color, and thread. Yet Miss Lang claims she lost it 2 weeks ago in rehearsal. The fraying is too fresh. He produced the half-burned note we had taken from Slade's lodgings. Holding it beside a page of Beatrice's rehearsal notes, obtained earlier from the stage manager, he placed them side by side on a prop table. The loops on the G and Y were identical. The slant of the letters matched, yet the pressure on the Blackmail note was heavier, as though written in anger or haste. Here, then, was the moment the smolder became visible flame. Holmes straightened, eyes alight. The spark, visual detail. The mud upon Slade's boots was of a peculiar reddish clay, mixed with coal dust and traces of copper filings peculiar to the Admiralty furnace at Royal Mint Street. The kindling, reasoning. Such a combination exists in only one location in London, the narrow back alleys behind that foundry. Slade had no connection to naval contracts or metal work. Someone moved the body there after the murder, intending to divert suspicion from the theatre district. The flame, past case parallel. I encountered a strikingly similar deception in the matter I have entitled The Red-Headed League. There, too, a criminal constructed an elaborate alibi, while the ground beneath his feet betrayed him. The prisoner's trousers were stained with clay from a tunnel he denied digging. He believed all eyes would remain fixed on the fantastic story of the league above, never glancing downward to the telltale earth. The criminal mind so frequently forgets that the earth remembers every step, that boots carry away evidence long after the deed is done. In that earlier case the clay was on the knees. Here it is copper filings on the soles, yet the principle remains unchanged. The killers sought to point away from the Lyceum, but pointed instead to their own fatal oversight. The blaze, conclusion plus listener. Therefore Slade was murdered near the theatre, likely in or near the stage door alley, and transported to the Foundry district, then dumped in Limehouse to complete the misdirection. The ember catches fire. Watson, do you see it? Do you see it, dear listener? Reflection, approx. 250 words. Looking back, I should have recognized the significance of the perfume from the very first evening. The heliotrope was no random scent. It was a vanity, a signature left by someone who believed their cleverness placed them beyond reach. Holmes has taught me repeatedly that the smallest particular, a fragrance, a thread, a loop in handwriting, can become the thread that unravels the entire web. Observation is not passive sight. It is disciplined attention, the refusal to let the obvious obscure the significant. The world is full of obvious things which nobody observes. Yet when one trains oneself to see, the fog lifts, the shadows retreat, and truth stands plain in the gaslight. You, dear reader, may already have guessed whose hand penned those letters. But at the time I confess I remained in darkness, still groping among half-formed suspicions while Holmes had already kindled the blaze. His powers never ceased to astonish me. The embers smoldered. Smoke was rising. We left the theatre in silence, the winter dusk closing in. Holmes walked with rapid steps, coat collar turned up against the wind. The first true flame had caught. The conflagration could not now be far behind. From such small embers, conflagrations grow. Chapter 4. Fanning the Flames. The fourth day dawned raw and grey, with an icy wind whipping down Baker Street and carrying the sharp tang of frozen horse manure and distant coal smoke. The fire in our sitting room burned steadily, yet Holmes seemed restless. He paced before the hearth in his mouse-colored dressing gown, pipe clenched between his teeth, smoke culling upward like signals from a battlefield. The embers we had gathered were now ready to be fanned into open flame, and he wasted no time. "We test theories today, Watson," he said abruptly. "False trails will burn out quickly. The true one will grow stronger." Our first visit was to Harold Finch, the Lyceum manager, at his private office behind the dress circle. The room was stuffy, smelling of old ledgers, carbolic soap, and the faint sweetness of the manager's pomade. Finch sat behind a polished mahogany desk, collar already damp with perspiration though the morning was chill. "Embezzlement?" he blustered when Holmes laid the discrepancies before him. "Mere clerical errors, overlooked receipts, that's all." Holmes leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Small sums, yes, but enough to make a man desperate if discovery threatened his position. Enough, perhaps, to make him contemplate silencing a blackmailer who knew too much." Finch's hands trembled as he tugged at his collar. "I never met Slade. I swear it." Holmes glanced down. Finch's shoes were immaculately polished, no trace of reddish clay, no copper filings. "Your boots have not been near the foundry," Holmes observed. "Nor, I think, near any murder scene." Finch left the room in haste, relief warring with fear on his flushed face. A false trail had flickered and died. Next we sought Sir Charles Wentworth at his club in St. James's Street. The air inside was warm, heavy with the scent of leather chairs, Turkish tobacco, and polished brass. "A rose thorn," he explained smoothly when Holmes inquired. "My gardens at Kensington are overgrown." Holmes drew closer, studying the wound. A thorn indeed, or the glancing edge of a knife. "The depth is consistent with a defensive block, and the angle suggests the blade came from below, as though the wielder was shorter than yourself." Sir Charles paled, but maintained composure. "Preposterous. I have no knowledge of this Slade creature." "Yet you knew Miss Gray's past from the beginning," Holmes said softly. "You loved her enough to overlook it, until the blackmail threatened your own reputation and prospects. A nobleman cannot afford scandal." Sir Charles rose. "I have nothing more to say." As he departed, Holmes murmured to me. His denial was too quick, his color too changeable. The scratch smolders. We turned then to a third suspect, Alfred Crowe, the journalist who had been haunting the Lyceum for weeks, sniffing after scandal. We found him in a dingy chop house near Fleet Street, the air thick with fried onions, cheap cigarette smoke, and spilled ale. Crowe was lean, ferret-faced, eyes darting. "I bought heliotrope once," he admitted when confronted, "for a lady friend. But I never met Slade. I only wanted a story." Holmes produced the small bottle from LaCroix. Crowe sniffed it and shook his head. "Mine was weaker, cheaper stuff." "Not this." A quick examination of Crowe's coat pockets revealed no missing buttons, no reddish mud on his shoes. Another false fire guttered out. The true pressure came at dusk, back at the Lyceum. Beatrice Lang was alone in her dressing room, removing makeup under the hissing gas jets. Holmes entered without knocking, the half-burned note and the found button in his hand. "Explain this," he said, placing both on her table. Beatrice stared, then broke. Tears welled. Her hands shook. "I was in Limehouse that night, but only to pay a debt to Slade. He had letters of mine, foolish letters from years ago. I paid him £20. I saw nothing of murder. When I heard of his death, I panicked and ran." Holmes watched her steadily. "The button? It tore away when I climbed the fence to escape. I swear I did not kill him." Holmes let a long silence stretch. Then he nodded once. "You may go, but remain in London." The truth is not yet fully alight. She fled, sobbing quietly. Holmes turned to me, eyes bright. She speaks truth. Her terror is genuine. Yet the button was planted near the body after she left. Someone wished to direct suspicion toward the understudy. We walked back through the fog-bound streets, gas lamps hissing, hansom cabs clattering past. Holmes's steps were rapid, energized. Some flames died today, he said. Finch's petty thefts, Crow's opportunism. They flickered and went out, but others grow stronger. I could feel the heat of the approaching blaze. You, dear reader, may already see the shape of the fire. Did you note how each suspect's denial revealed more than it concealed? Holmes paused beneath a lamp, drew deeply on his pipe. False fires died. The true flame burns brighter. False fires died. Others grew stronger. Chapter 5. The fire catches. The fifth day broke with a bitter frost that turned the cobblestones of Baker Street white and brittle underfoot. The air tasted metallic, sharp with coal smoke and the frozen breath of the city. Inside 221B the fire roared high, yet Holmes moved with restless energy, leaping up suddenly from his chair to pace before the grate, eyes alight with the peculiar fire I had come to recognize as the moment of true ignition. The kindling we had gathered was dry. Now the blaze would catch. A telegram arrived at breakfast, short, urgent, from the foreman of the Royal Mint Street Foundry. Disturbance noted in Admiralty Furnace yard night of murder. Brass ingot mold overturned. Come at once. Holmes folded the paper with a snap. The final ember, Watson. We go immediately. We took a hansom eastward, the cab rattling over frozen ruts, the horses whose striking sparks from the stones. The foundry lay in a grim warren of alleys behind Whitechapel, its chimneys pouring black smoke into the pale sky. The foreman, a burly man named Macready, met us at the iron gates, breath steaming. He led us through soot-grimed yards to the rear fence, where a brass mold had been toppled. Its contents spilled like frozen quicksilver across the ground. There, Macready said, pointing. Caught on the spikes last night or early morning? Holmes crouched. Caught on a rusted barb was a woman's glove, fine kid leather, lavender-scented, monogrammed in silver thread with the letters B.L. Beatrice Lang. Lestrade, summoned by telegram, arrived moments later, scowling. Case closed, he declared. The understudy killed Slade to silence him, left the glove in panic. Body dumped here to confuse us. Holmes rose slowly, turning the glove in his fingers. He brought it close to his face, inhaled, then examined the stitching with his lens. The spark, visual detail. The glove bears the unmistakable scent of heliotrope, yet the thread is machine-sewn, tight, uniform, done yesterday or the day before at the earliest. Beatrice Lang's gloves, as we observed at the theater, are hand-stitched, finer work, older thread. The kindling, reasoning. This is a forgery, planted deliberately. The monogram matches, the scent matches, but the construction betrays it. Someone obtained one of Miss Lang's gloves, copied it hastily, scented it, and left it here to point suspicion away from themselves. The flame, past case parallel. A similar ruse was employed in the matter I have called The Adventure of the Speckled Band. There, a bell rope was hung beside a bed to simulate supernatural danger, yet close inspection revealed it was a dummy, hollow, non-functional, place to mislead. The true peril came from the vent above. Here the glove serves the same purpose, an obvious clue meant to draw every eye while the real hand that wielded the knife remains hidden. The criminal believes that by providing a perfect scapegoat, the truth will never be sought further. Yet such planted evidence always carries the flaw of haste. The blaze, conclusion plus listener. Beatrice Lang is innocent of murder. The glove was left by Sir Charles Wentworth. He murdered Slade to silence the blackmail forever, knowing exposure would destroy his engagement to Miss Grey and his standing in society. He moved the body to the foundry, then to Limehouse, planted this false evidence, and scratched his own hand in the struggle. The fire has caught, Watson. No stopping it now. Do you see the blaze, dear listener? Do you see how every ember now feeds the same flame? Lestrade stared, mouth half open. You have proof enough to confront him, Holmes replied. But first, let us return to Baker Street. There is one final testament. We reached 221B as dusk fell, the gas lamps hissing to life along the street. Holmes sent urgent messages. One to Miss Gray, one to Sir Charles requesting an immediate meeting regarding a matter of the utmost delicacy. Within the hour Sir Charles arrived, immaculate as ever, though the scratch on his hand had darkened to an angry red. He entered the sitting room with forced calm. The fire crackled. The smell of Holmes' shag tobacco hung thick. Miss Gray sat pale in the corner, Mrs. Hudson hovering protectively nearby. Mr. Holmes, Sir Charles began. This is irregular. Holmes cut him short. He placed the forged glove on the table, beside the half-burned note, the clipped watermark envelopes, the envelope of copper-flecked mud. You purchased the heliotrope for Miss Gray, Holmes said quietly. You knew her past, loved her in spite of it, yet when Slade demanded money to keep silent, you saw ruin. You paid him once, twice. Then you lured him to the theater alley after dark, stabbed him with your own dagger, the same blade that nicked your hand in defense. You dragged the body to the foundry, knowing the mud would mislead, then moved it to Limehouse. You planted the glove, sewn in haste, to implicate Beatrice Lang. Every detail points to you. Sir Charles stood rigid, his face drained of color. You have no proof. I have the wound that matches a knife, not a rose. I have the perfume you alone bought in quantity. I have the handwriting. Your imitation of Miss Lang's is skillful, yet the pressure betrays anger. And I have this. Holmes produced a small brass button from his pocket, matching those on Sir Charles's overcoat, found near the overturned mold. Sir Charles staggered back a step. Miss Gray gave a small cry. The room seemed to hold its breath. I acted to protect her, he whispered at last. To protect us. The confession came in broken fragments. Motive, means, opportunity, all laid bare. Lestrade stepped forward to place him under arrest. The fire had caught. Nothing could extinguish it now. Chapter 6. Spreading blaze. With Sir Charles Wentworth's confession still ringing in the air, the blaze spread rapidly, illuminating corners long shrouded in shadow. The sixth day dawned colder than any before, the frost thick on the window panes of 221B Baker Street, the fire in the grate burning with fierce, steady heat. Outside, the city stirred slowly under a pool of coal smoke and frozen fog. Inside, the sitting room felt almost warm by contrast, though the chill of revelation lingered. Holmes had scarcely slept. He stood now by the window, fingers steepled beneath his chin, watching the first hansom cabs clatter past below. The smell of strong shag tobacco filled the room. His pipe had been lit since dawn. I poured myself a cup of bitter coffee from the gasogene, the metallic taste grounding me after the night's turmoil. Miss Lavinia Gray arrived early, escorted by Mrs. Hudson. She looked exhausted yet composed, the storm cloud eyes clearer now that the worst fear had passed. She sat on the edge of the worn leather chair, gloved hands clasped tightly. You knew, she said quietly to Holmes. From the first letter. I suspected, Holmes replied. The heliotrope was no accident. Sir Charles purchased it for you regularly, enough that the shopkeeper remembered his face even when he claimed anonymity. He loved you, Miss Gray, enough to overlook your past as Nellie Brown. But love, when threatened by scandal, can twist into something darker. She bowed her head. He never spoke of it, never once reproached me. I thought we could begin anew. Holmes paced slowly before the fire, the coal settling with soft cracks. He paid Slade twice in secret. Small sums at first, enough to buy silence. But the final demand for £1,000 came with a threat to expose everything to the press and to his family. Sir Charles saw ruin. The engagement broken, his name dragged through the mud, his prospects in society ended. He arranged to meet Slade in the narrow alley behind the Lyceum stage door after the evening performance. There, in the shadows, he struck, once cleanly, with the dagger he carried for protection. The wound on his own hand came when Slade tried to wrest the blade away. I leaned forward. And the body? Dragged to a waiting cab. Sir Charles had a private hansom waiting at the end of the lane. He conveyed it to the Royal Mint Street Foundry, knowing the distinctive mud would mislead any investigator. Later, under cover of darkness, he moved it again to the Limehouse warehouse, planting the envelope to suggest a blackmail gone wrong. The forged glove was his final touch, hastily sewn at a Whitechapel tailor's, scented with heliotrope to match Beatrice Lang's perfume, left on the fence to draw every eye to the understudy. Miss Grey's voice trembled. Why implicate Beatrice? She has been loyal, ambitious, yes, but never cruel. To deflect suspicion from himself, Holmes said, an understudy with motive, jealousy, rivalry, makes a plausible scapegoat. He imitated her hand in the letters, using samples from her rehearsal notes. The loops matched. Only the pressure betrayed the forger's suppressed rage. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of the gas lamps and the distant chime of Big Ben marking the hour. Miss Grey rose, walked to the window, stared into the fog-shrouded street. I loved him, she whispered, or thought I did. Now I see only the man who would have destroyed me to save himself. Holmes stopped pacing. His eyes held that peculiar light, satisfaction tempered with something almost like pity. The blaze has spread, Miss Grey, he said gently. Every shadow is revealed. Sir Charles will face justice. The courts will decide his fate. But you are free. Your past is no longer a weapon. Return to the stage. The lights await you. She turned, tears glistening but unshed. And Beatrice, already cleared. She wept with relief this morning when Lestrade informed her. The theatre will not suffer. Scandal avoided is scandal prevented. Reflection, approx. 250 words. Looking back upon these events, I marvel once more at how the smallest details, the perfume on a letter, the mud on a boot, the frayed thread of a glove, can become the threads that bind a man to his own downfall. The criminal mind errs most fatally in believing that complexity conceals truth. Sir Charles thought to weave an elaborate web of misdirection, yet each strand pointed back to him. The familiar scent he himself had chosen, the ground that remembered his footsteps, the haste that floored his forgery. Holmes has shown me again that observation is the great leveler. It defeats deception not by force, but by patience, by refusing to let the obvious obscure the significant. The world is crowded with lies that seem solid until the light of careful attention falls upon them. Then they burn away like dry tinder. You, dear reader, may have followed the embers step by step and arrived at the same conclusion long before the confession. Yet at the time, even I, his closest companion, felt the wonder of it anew. The blaze had illuminated what had long been hidden in shadow. Holmes turned back to the fire, drawing deeply on his pipe. The smoke curled upward, mingling with the warmth of the room. London outside began to stir more fully, the fog thinning as the sun climbed. The truth burns bright now, he said quietly. Nothing remains concealed. The blaze illuminated what had long been hidden in shadow. Chapter 7. The Conflagration. The seventh day arrived with a pale, wintry sun that did little to warm the frost-rimed streets of London. Inside 221B Baker Street, the coal fire blazed high, casting flickering shadows across the scattered papers, the chemical apparatus, and the VR bullet holes in the opposite wall. The air smelled strongly of shag tobacco and the faint, lingering trace of heliotrope that still clung to the evidence on the table. Holmes had summoned us all here for the final accounting. Inspector Lestrade, Miss Lavinia Gray, Beatrice Lang, Harold Finch, and, under close guard, Sir Charles Wentworth himself. The nobleman sat rigid in a straight-backed chair, wrists bound with coarse rope, his once immaculate morning coat creased and stained. Holmes stood before the fire, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes gleaming with that peculiar, triumphant light. He had not lounged in his mouse-colored dressing gown today. He wore his usual Inverness cape and deerstalker, as though ready to stride out into the city the moment the truth was fully ablaze. Let us review the embers one by one. He began, voice calm yet carrying the weight of inevitable revelation. From these small, glowing fragments, the whole truth burns bright. He lifted the first letter from the pile. The heliotrope perfume, sold at Parfumerie LaCroix to only 3 parties in recent weeks. Miss Grey herself, her understudy Beatrice Lang, and one gentleman who paid cash and gave no name. That gentleman was Sir Charles Wentworth. He purchased it regularly as a gift for his fiancée, yet used the same scent to mark the blackmail letters, believing it would never be traced back to him. Sir Charles shifted, but said nothing. Holmes moved to the envelope of reddish clay, the mud on Slade's boots, peculiar reddish clay mixed with coal dust and copper filings from the Admiralty furnace at Royal Mint Street. No blackmailer frequents naval foundries. Slade was murdered behind the Lyceum, then dragged to that yard to mislead us. Only someone familiar with London's byways, and with a private hansom at his disposal, could have effected the transfer without drawing notice. Next, the half-burned note from Slade's lodgings. Holmes placed it beside a page of Beatrice Lang's rehearsal script. The loops on the G and Y are identical, yet the pressure is heavier, angrier. Sir Charles imitated Miss Lang's hand, skillfully, but not perfectly. The forgery betrays suppressed rage. He turned to the forged glove, machine sewn, hastily done, scented with heliotrope, monogrammed B. L. Beatrice's own gloves are hand-stitched. This was planted on the foundry fence to direct suspicion toward the understudy, a convenient rival. The button found near the body matched it, yet Beatrice's were intact when we examined them. Beatrice gave a small, relieved sob. Miss Grey reached to clasp her hand. Holmes lifted the small brass button from Sir Charles's overcoat, found near the overturned mold. It matches your coat exactly, Sir Charles. You lost it in haste while planting the glove. Sir Charles's face had drained to the color of old parchment. I intended no lasting harm to Beatrice, yet you would have let her hang for your crime, Holmes said quietly. Finally, the wound on your left hand, not a rose thorn, but the glancing edge of Slade's knife as he struggled. The angle, the depth, all consistent with a defensive wound from a shorter assailant. You stabbed him once, through the heart, then panicked when he fought back. The room was silent save for the crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of the gas lamps. Lestrade cleared his throat. You have nothing to add, Sir Charles? The prisoner looked up, eyes hollow. I acted to protect her, to protect us both. Slade would have destroyed everything. When he demanded £1,000 and threatened to send the letters to the newspapers and to my family, I saw no other way. Miss Grey rose slowly. You saw no other way but murder? You knew my past from the beginning. I trusted you with it, and you repaid me with blood. Sir Charles bowed his head. Forgive me, Lavinia. I loved you too much. Holmes stepped forward. Love twisted by fear is no excuse. The world is full of obvious things which nobody observes. Yet when one does observe, no deception can stand. You forgot that the ground remembers every step, that scents linger, that buttons betray, that handwriting carries the pressure of the hand that guides it. You eliminated no impossibilities. You merely created new ones. He turned to Lestrade. The case is complete. Slade was murdered by Sir Charles Wentworth on the night in question, behind the Lyceum Theatre. The body was moved twice to mislead investigation. Motive: preservation of reputation and marriage. Means: his own dagger. Opportunity: his intimate knowledge of Miss Grey's schedule and the theatre's routines. Lestrade nodded grimly. Sir Charles Wentworth, I arrest you for the murder of Edward Slade. 2 constables stepped forward. Sir Charles rose without resistance, though his shoulders sagged as though the weight of truth had finally crushed him. As they led him toward the door, he paused, looking back at Miss Grey. I never wished you harm, he whispered. She met his gaze steadily. Yet harm was done. The door closed behind them. The sitting room seemed suddenly larger, quieter. Beatrice wiped her eyes. Finch muttered something about returning to the theatre accounts. Miss Grey turned to Holmes. How can I ever thank you? Holmes inclined his head. By returning to the stage, Miss Grey. The lights are yours again. The scandal dies with the confession. She smiled, small, genuine, for the first time since her arrival. Then I shall. And I shall never forget the man who saw the embers when all others saw only darkness. Holmes drew upon his pipe, smoke curling upward. Truth blazed forth. No darkness could survive such light. Truth blazed forth. No darkness could survive such light. Chapter 8. Ashes and Justice. The 8th day dawned quiet and clear, the first in many without the heavy blanket of fog that had shrouded London for so long. A pale sun filtered through the windows of 221B Baker Street, catching motes of dust in the still air and warming the worn Persian carpet beneath our feet. The coal fire had burned low overnight. Only embers remained, glowing softly in the grate like the last remnants of the great blaze that had consumed the case. The room smelled faintly of cold tobacco ash and the lingering sweetness of Mrs. Hudson's breakfast, hot buttered toast and strong tea that steamed in the chill. I rose early, my military habits never quite abandoned, and found Holmes already at the table, sorting through the final papers with methodical calm. He had discarded his Inverness cape. The mouse-colored dressing gown hung loosely about him once more. His pipe lay cold beside the Persian slipper. Sir Charles was taken to Bow Street last night, he said without preamble. Lestrade expects the magistrate's hearing within the week. The evidence is overwhelming. There will be no bail. I nodded, pouring tea for us both. The bitter taste steadied me. And Miss Grey? She returned to the Lyceum at dawn. Rehearsal resumes tomorrow. The management has issued a brief statement. Personal matters resolved. No truth to malicious rumors. The scandal dies quietly, as scandals do when truth burns them away. We sat in companionable silence for a time. The only sounds the soft crackle of settling coals and the distant clatter of hansom cabs on Baker Street. Then came a knock. Immerse. Hudson, bearing a note from Scotland Yard. Lestrade's handwriting was brisk. Wentworth's confession formalized at 2 a.m. Full account matches your deductions to the letter. Beatrice Lang cleared entirely. No charges. Harold Finch has repaid the missing theatre funds. Small amounts, but honest restitution. Case closed. Holmes. My thanks. Holmes folded the note and placed it on the mantel beside the bullet-pocked VR. Justice rises from the ashes, Watson, as it always must. Miss Lavinia Grey arrived near noon, unaccompanied. Her veil lifted and her step lighter than I had yet seen. The storm cloud eyes were bright. Fear had been replaced by a quiet resolve. She wore a simple grey cloak over a dark dress. No fur, no ostentation. The heliotrope perfume was absent. I came to thank you properly, she said, voice steady. Last night I slept without dreams of exposure for the first time in months. Holmes inclined his head. You owe thanks to observation, not to me. The embers were there for anyone who cared to look. She smiled, a small, genuine curve of the lips. Yet only you fanned them into flame. The theatre is abuzz. Beatrice has been wonderful. She wept when she learned the truth, then embraced me like a sister. We shall share the dressing room again. The understudy no longer fears the star, nor the star the shadow of the past. I offered her tea. She accepted, cradling the cup in gloved hands. The warmth seemed to ease the last tension from her shoulders. "Sir Charles," she began, then paused. "He wrote me from the cells. A short note. He asked forgiveness, not for the murder, he said, but for the betrayal of trust. I have not replied. I cannot yet. Time will decide that," Holmes said quietly. "Some wounds heal, some scar. Justice does not require your pardon." She nodded. "The company has cancelled no performances. The public knows only that a blackmailer was killed and the matter resolved. My name remains untarnished. I owe you my career, Mr. Holmes, and my future." Holmes waved a hand. "The future is yours to shape. Return to the lights. Let the stage be your sanctuary again." Beatrice Lang arrived shortly after, breathless from the cold walk, cheeks flushed. She carried a small posy of winter roses, red against the grey day. She thrust them toward Miss Grey with a shy smile. "For you," she said, "and for everything." Miss Grey accepted the flowers, eyes softening. "We begin anew, Beatrice. No more rivalry, only the work." The two women embraced, briefly, warmly. Then Beatrice turned to Holmes. "They say you saved me from the gallows before I even knew I was in danger. I don't know how to thank you." "By succeeding on the stage," Holmes replied. "Let your talent be the repayment." Finch came last, hat in hand, perspiring despite the cold. He had brought a banker's draft, every shilling of the embezzled funds repaid to the theatre's accounts. "I was a fool," he admitted, voice thick. "Greed blinded me, but no more. The books are clean. The house will thrive." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Honesty is its own justice, Mr. Finch. See that it endures." Finch left with bowed head but straighter shoulders. The room emptied gradually, leaving only Holmes and me beside the dying fire. "From ashes, justice rose," Holmes murmured, stirring the embers with the poker until fresh flames licked upward. "Slade's death was the spark, Sir Charles's confession the blaze. Now only embers remain, and they cool." I looked at the grate, where the last glow faded to grey ash. Outside, London moved on, hansoms rattling, vendors calling, the great city indifferent to the private dramas that had unfolded in its shadows. Yet within these walls, a measure of order had been restored. Miss Grey would tread the boards again, her secret safe. Beatrice would rise without fear. Finch would labor honestly. Sir Charles would face the law's judgment, stern, impartial, inevitable. The fire crackled once more, then settled. Justice, like truth, had burned clean. From ashes, justice rose, as it always must. Chapter 9. Embers cool. The ninth day brought a tentative calm to London, the kind that follows a long storm. The frost had melted under a weak midday sun, leaving the cobblestones of Baker Street slick and gleaming. A fresh wind carried the clean scent of wet stone and distant river mud, sweeping away the last traces of coal smoke that had hung so heavily over the city. Inside 221B the fire burned low and steady, no longer roaring with the urgency of pursuit, but settling into a gentle, comforting glow. The sitting room felt larger without the weight of evidence scattered across the table. The chemical apparatus had been tidied, the Persian slipper refilled but untouched. I found Holmes lounging in his armchair, legs stretched toward the grate, violin resting across his knees. He plucked a few soft, idle notes, nothing of the wild improvisations that sometimes filled the room during a case, but a quiet melody, almost reflective. The Stradivarius sang gently, then fell silent. "The embers cool at last," he murmured, setting the instrument aside. "The blaze has done its work." Miss Lavinia Gray returned to the Lyceum that morning for the first full rehearsal since the nightmare began. Word reached us through a brief note delivered by a theatre boy. The company greeted her with applause when she stepped onto the stage. No whispers of scandal followed. The management had handled the matter with Victorian discretion. The newspapers printed only a curt paragraph. Tragic death of known blackmailer Edward, Slade resolved by arrest of private individual, no connection to theatrical world, and then moved on to fresher sensations. Miss Grey's name remained bright in the playbills. Her performance of Lady Macbeth scheduled for the following week. Beatrice Lang had transformed in the aftermath. The ambitious understudy, once shadowed by jealousy and fear, now walked taller. She sent Holmes a small parcel, 2 tickets to the opening night, wrapped in tissue with a card that read simply, "For the man who saw what no one else did. Thank you." When I met her briefly at the stage door later that day, she spoke with quiet gratitude. "I thought my career was over before it began," she said, breath misting in the chill air. "Now I feel free. Lavinia has asked me to share scenes with her in rehearsal. We're no longer rivals. We're colleagues." Harold Finch, too, had changed. The stout manager arrived at Baker Street in the afternoon, hat in hand, a banker's draft already delivered to the theatre treasurer. He had repaid every shilling of the petty embezzlements, small sums, but taken with guilt that had festered for months. "I was a fool," he admitted, standing awkwardly on the threshold. "Greed made me blind, but seeing Sir Charles's fall, it woke me. The books are clean now. The house will prosper honestly." Holmes regarded him with that cool, appraising gaze. "Honesty is its own reward, Mr. Finch. See that it endures." Finch nodded, bowed slightly, and departed with lighter step than when he arrived. As evening fell, the fog returned, soft, not oppressive, wrapping the gas lamps in gentle halos. Miss Grey came once more to Baker Street, this time alone and unhurried. She wore a simple wool traveling cloak, no veil, no tremor in her hands. The storm-cloud eyes were calm. "I leave for a short rest in the country tomorrow," she said. "A week with friends in Kent, then back to the stage. I wanted to say goodbye properly." She sat by the fire, accepting a glass of brandy from the Tantalus. The sweet spirit warmed her cheeks. "I have thought much these past days," she continued, "about the past I tried to bury. Nellie Brown was not a shameful secret. She was a girl who survived. The child in Stepney, I have made inquiries. He is well, apprenticed to a printer, happy. One day, perhaps, I shall meet him, not as a scandal, but as a mother who could not keep him then but can honor him now." Holmes inclined his head. "The truth, once revealed, loses its power to wound. You have reclaimed it." She smiled, a full, unshadowed smile. "Thanks to you, and to the small things you noticed, the perfume, the mud, the button. They saved me." I spoke then, my voice rough with feeling. "You have a future ahead, Miss Grey. The lights will welcome you back." She rose, embraced me briefly, a sisterly gesture, then turned to Holmes. He stood, took her hand, bowed over it with old-fashioned courtesy. "Until we meet again on the boards," she said. When she had gone, the room settled into profound quiet. Holmes returned to his chair, picked up the violin again, played a few bars of a slow air, something from Bach, measured and serene. The notes drifted upward, mingling with the scent of burning coal and the faint aroma of brandy. London breathed easier that night. The great city, so often indifferent to private sorrows, had absorbed another drama and moved on. No more blackmail letters arrived at the Lyceum. No more shadows lurked behind the stage door. The transformations were complete. A criminal dragged from shadow into light and justice. An innocent cleared and strengthened. A mystery extinguished. Holmes himself, once languid with boredom, now quietly satisfied. The fog-shrouded city granted a measure of dawn clarity. I looked at my friend across the firelight. "Another case closed." He smiled faintly. "Until the next ember glows." The embers cooled at last. Peace returned. Chapter 10. By the fire at Baker Street, the 10th day closed with a gentle dusk that settled over Baker Street like a soft woolen shawl. The fog had retreated entirely. The sky above the rooftops showed a rare clear blue fading to rose and violet. Inside 221B, the coal fire burned with a steady, contented crackle, throwing warm light across the familiar clutter. The Stradivarius resting on its chair, the Persian slipper bulging with shag, the gasogene and Tantalus gleaming on the sideboard, the 17 steps still echoing faintly from Mrs. Hudson's last visit with a tray of hot buttered muffins and a pot of strong tea. Holmes lounged in his armchair, legs stretched toward the grate, mouse-colored dressing gown loosely tied, pipe drawing slowly between his lips. The smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, mingling with the sweet scent of burning coal and the faint, comforting aroma of Mrs. Hudson's baking. I sat opposite him, notebook closed at last, the final entry written in my journal with a sense of quiet completion. The case of the actress and the blackmail scheme had ended not in dramatic gunfire or midnight chase, but in the ordinary triumph of truth over deception. "The embers have cooled," Holmes said softly, watching the flames dance. "Yet they leave a certain warmth, do they not?" I nodded, sipping brandy that tasted of sweet oak and winter nights. "Miss Grey opens in Macbeth tomorrow. The house is sold out. Beatrice sent word. She will understudy no longer. She has been given her own small part in the next production. Finch reports the theatre's accounts are spotless. Even Lestrade wrote a grudging note of thanks. Your methods, Holmes, are irregular, but effective." Holmes smiled thinly. High praise from the yard. We sat in companionable silence for some minutes, the fire popping softly, the violin silent but present, as though waiting for a mood to call it forth. At length Holmes spoke again, voice low and reflective. "Consider the science of deduction, Watson. It is no magic. It is disciplined observation, the refusal to let the obvious obscure the significant. A scent on paper, a trace of mud on a boot, a missing button, the pressure of ink on a page. These are not trifles. They are embers. Most men walk past them unseeing. The criminal counts on their blindness. He overcomplicates his tale, weaves elaborate alibis, plants false clues, believing complexity will shield him. Yet the simplest things, the ground that remembers footsteps, the scent that lingers, the thread that frays, betray him every time." He drew on his pipe, eyes half closed, the firelight catching the peculiar gleam in them. "Recall a scandal in Bohemia. Irene Adler nearly bested me, not through violence or cunning disguise, but through understanding that small details matter. She left a photograph, knowing it would be sought. I left her photograph in my files as a reminder. The cleverest criminal errs by assuming no one will look closely. Sir Charles made the same mistake. He moved the body, forged a glove, imitated handwriting, yet forgot that the perfume he himself had chosen would lead us back to him, that the mud would speak of the foundry, that his own hand would press too heavily on the pen in anger." I leaned forward. "The criminal mind's fatal flaw, then? Overconfidence in deception. Lies are kindling, Watson, dry, eager to burn. Truth is the match. Once struck, the blaze consumes everything false. Observation defeats deception because it demands patience, precision, humility before the facts. The world is full of obvious things which nobody observes. When one does observe, truly observe, the shadows retreat, the fog lifts, and justice stands plain in the gaslight." He paused, staring into the flames as though seeing the entire case replayed there. The trembling woman at her door, the letters smelling of heliotrope, the reddish clay on dead boots, the forged glove on the fence, the confession in this very room. Miss Grey's salvation lay in trusting those small things, he continued. She brought the letters to us rather than pay in silence. She allowed scrutiny of her past rather than let fear rule. That courage, quiet, unheroic, combined with observation, saved her. Society may still judge her origins harshly, yet she has reclaimed them. The child in Stepney will one day know a mother who faced truth instead of hiding from it. Beatrice rises without shadow. Finch walks honest. Even Sir Charles, in his fall, is granted the dignity of facing consequence rather than living a lie. I set my glass down. And you, Holmes? You were languid with boredom when this began. Now you seem satisfied. He chuckled, a rare, soft sound. The mind requires fuel, Watson. A puzzle worthy of the chase. This one provided it. The game was afoot. The embers glowed. The blaze spread, and now it cools. Tomorrow I may be restless again, but tonight the fire is enough. He reached for the violin, tucked it under his chin, and drew the bow across the strings. A slow, measured air filled the room, something old and English, peaceful, like the settling of a long day. The notes rose and fell with the crackle of the coals, blending firelight and music into one gentle warmth. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the melody wash over me. The city outside moved on, hansoms rattling homeward, gas lamps hissing into life, the great wheel of London turning as ever. Yet here, in this small room at the top of 17 steps, a measure of order had been restored. Truth had burned away lies. Embers had become flame, then ashes, then peace. Holmes set the violin down. Cultivate observation, dear listener, he said quietly, as though addressing not only me, but every reader who might one day follow these pages. Watch the small things, the mud on a boot, the scent on a letter, the loop in a hand. They are embers. Fan them with attention, and you shall light your own truth. The world is dark enough. Let no deception go unchallenged. The fire settled to a soft red glow. Holmes leaned back, pipe in hand, eyes on the flames. Until the next ember glows, dear listener, he said, the game is always afoot. Until the next ember glows, dear listener, the game is always afoot.